Okay, so hello everybody. My name's Naomi Rankin. I'm the leader of the Communist Party in Alberta, and I'd like to first of all welcome everyone. Say how glad we are to see you in attendance. I see there's some party members, some not, some long-term old friends, some new people. So I'm happy to see that we've got an audience from different places in the province tonight. So before we begin, I think we need to acknowledge that we are on the indigenous lands of several different nations and peoples throughout Alberta. That the Communist Party recognizes the rights of indigenous people to self-government on their own lands, and that we support their struggles to protect those lands against environmental depredation, corporate plunder, and the encroachments of the federal government attempting to overthrow their historic Indigenous rights. We will continue to support those rights and to support those struggles. And until we are at the stage of having a working class government in Canada that will be in a position to negotiate a new era of equality amongst nations within Canada. So tonight's subject is the energy sector in Alberta, to give just a very general overview of the political economy, what the forces involved are, what the strategic balance of forces of the classes within the energy sector is, and what our party's platform approach to economic development. So what I want to do is just give a very brief overview presentation, and then leave hopefully the bulk of the meeting time for questions and discussion. So I will now going to share my screen and shift to my little slideshow. So are you seeing it properly?
Yeah, it's on our screens.
Yeah, okay. So basically there's a couple of points that I would like to discuss very briefly. The current political economy of energy in Alberta, a comparison to Norway. Norway is one of the other fossil fuel economies where we do often hear comparisons, and it I think throws a lot of light on what's possible even under capitalism, the different strategies that could be possible. Then to look very briefly at some aspects of our party election platform from the last election that deal specifically with this area. This is not necessarily what our platform will be in the coming election, but I think when we look at our platform from the last time around, it stood the test of time really quite well. And our election platform from last time is going to be the basis of discussion within the party to update it, refine it, and bring forward a relevant and useful election platform in the coming provincial election this May. So, and then to talk something about the overall strategy of how we put forward our platform and our program, not restricting ourselves to election campaigns, but talking about our strategy more generally. So the features of the energy sector, fossil fuel economy in Alberta. The first is the one-sided development of the Alberta economy, that instead of making the very rich resources that we have within the province the basis of an all-sided highly developed economy with manufacturing and trade in many different areas. The provincial government policies have helped to foster continuing dependence on fossil fuels and continuing lack of diversification. In particular, even within the fossil fuel sector, our economy is focused on resource extraction with very minimal secondary processing. We don't have, big plastics or even fertilizer industry in Alberta, the kinds of things that could be made from fossil fuels. By and large, our fossil fuels are simply exported as raw materials. This is the method of ensuring that the minimum number of jobs are created within the economy in Alberta and the maximum number of jobs are created elsewhere. So, and I think at the political level, it could be characterized as complete governmental subservience to corporate interests. And this is actually both at the provincial and the federal level when it comes to the energy sector. And the sector is dominated by large multinational corporations. They're not particularly Canadian corporations. They are very heavily slanted towards foreign-owned corporations. And from the very beginning of the era of development of fossil fuel exploitation in Alberta, the provincial government in particular has been taken a very weak position with respect to the corporations. They've not made use of their strength as the seller of these resources, which in fact belong to the, these are crown assets. The natural resources belong to the Canadian people as a whole, but both the provincial and the federal governments have taken very weak positions with respect to the foreign corporations in terms of the level of taxation, the level of royalties that they've charged, the conditions that they've imposed for anything like environmental protection or guarantee of jobs or contributing to infrastructure. The initial strategy of the provincial government in Alberta with respect to tar sands was in fact to set very low royalties and very low tax rates. They're essentially giving a tax and royalty holiday as an incentive for initial investment in these sectors, with the idea that as the sector became more established, that the royalty rates would go up when the corporations had started to make their investment back. But of course, this never happened. Since the era of Ralph Klein, we've had essentially neoliberal governments, and every successive provincial Tory leader has been more and more extreme in their willingness to cut corporate taxes, their willingness to cut social services and benefits to the working class in Alberta in order to make up for that shortfall of income. And they have been, each successive provincial government, Tory government, has been weaker with respect to the corporate sector, more subservient. It's also the case that even the NDP, when they were in government, were not strong enough to tackle this sector head on. The NDP, equally with the Tories, has tried to claim the mantle of Peter Lougheed, and to say that the fossil fuels are the bedrock and the center of the Alberta economy, and that it should remain so. So, so there's a, let's see if I can find this. I just wanted to show this this little table, which is this is actually from back in 2016, as you see. Payment per barrel in Canadian dollars to governments in Canada and abroad. And this is showing the case for a couple of different corporations. What's really striking here, I hope you can see these bars, that the payment per barrel in Canada is dwarfed by the payment in Nigeria and in Indonesia. And here, even down here for CNRL, the payment in Canada is dwarfed by the payment to Ivory Coast. Now, these are not large and powerful organized states. These are not enormous markets. If Nigeria, Indonesia, and Ivory Coast, to say nothing of the UK, can in fact collect payments at that rate, says here, Suncor paid 6 times more taxes in the UK. Canadian Natural Resources Limited, 4 times more to Ivory Coast. It really throws into relief what a tax holiday these corporations are getting within Canada. And they haven't stopped lobbying for further tax breaks and further concessions. Sorry. So now there's another article that, again, it's going back some time. This is in 2015. This is a comparison of the Norwegian and the Canadian methods of dealing with the oil and gas revenues, the Heritage Fund. Norway's didn't start until 1990. Just their development of their oil and gas sector just started later than in Alberta. Their fund is this was in 2015. The discrepancies are greater now. At that point, their fund was worth 1 trillion, while Alberta's was 17 billion. 17 billion sounds like a lot, but not compared to 1 trillion. And there's a number of ways in which these, we can compare and contrast how these, the Heritage Fund was handled, but also just the relations of the government to the corporations in general. Like the level of taxation that Norway established from the very start was a much higher level. That they continued to put the money, they continued to put 100% of those tax revenues into their Heritage Fund. And they restrict by law to 4% the amount that they can withdraw of the principal from that fund. Whereas in Alberta, the money put in was only 30% of royalties at the start. It was only ever done haphazardly, and essentially only continued for about a decade. And since then, the fund has been rated essentially just for day-to-day expenses, in order to make the provincial government look better, just to patch some of the economic shortfall from failing to tax the corporations and failing to collect the royalties which they should have. So in many ways, another aspect being that how the Heritage Fund is invested. In Norway, by law, they're pretty much required to invest in anything other than their own fossil fuel sector. Like the fund is required to be diversified, both in economic sector and geographically. Whereas in Alberta, a great deal of the investment that did come from the Heritage Fund was in fact a backhanded subsidy to the energy sector. It was invested in infrastructure for fossil fuel exports. So, so in all kinds of ways, Norway is not a socialist country. Norway is a capitalist country. So, but this comparison just shows puts into even more glaring relief how weak the Alberta government and the Canadian federal government have been with respect to the corporate demands of corporate lobbying within our own country. So that even from a capitalist point of view, they've grossly mismanaged this non-renewable resource and the amount of wealth which has been created. And so our our point of view on this matter, here again, this is taken mostly from our own election platform from the previous provincial election. It will have to be updated, and that's one of those things we'll be discussing in the next month and a half or so to be able to publish our election platform for 2023. But I believe this platform really does stand the test of time pretty well. Some of the key points in it being end work on Kinder Morgan expansion. Well, that was the sort of current critical pipeline issue at that moment. But generally speaking, like an end to pipeline construction and lowering the carbon emissions cap, creating a genuine cap on emissions, that any new production would have to be completely offset by carbon capture and sequestration. Immediately raising royalty rates at a fixed rate, not allowing them to rise and fall with the market prices. Then the next step would be to establish an Alberta Petroleum Marketing Corporation to have a monopoly on the sale of fossil fuels from Alberta. In other words, it would be this Crown Corporation would be the only entity that the producers could sell fossil fuels to, and it would be the only entity from which customers could buy fossil fuels from Alberta. So, in other words, by centralizing the buying and selling, we could essentially minimize the amount paid to the producers and maximize the amount received for the sale. This would essentially make royalties obsolete. And it would be the basis for being able to actually centralize the control of production and transportation of fossil fuels to create the basis for future public ownership of the entire sector. Force developers to pay the true cost of remediation. In other words, they've got to pay for the environmental damage that they've done, and they've got to pay to prevent future environmental damage. That any additional development would have to be done with payments up front to cover the cost of remediation afterwards. Then greatly expanding wind and solar energy and upgrading the energy grid to shift over to renewable sources. So another aspect of our platform deals with the issue of employment and diversifying the economy. So move away from dependence on resource extraction to value-added processing. So the first step could be just using our fossil fuels as feedstocks rather than exporting them unprocessed. Bring the energy industry under public control and use public ownership to diversify. Halt any new development in the tar sands, phasing out the tar sands. But, and this is a very important point, with jobs guaranteed at equivalent wages and benefits. I'll come back to this point a little bit later on, that it's really important that we're talking about job and income security for the workers who are displaced by this change in economic strategy. This has been put forward by others in the, notably some in the trade union movement, for decades now, usually going under the title of just transitions, and exactly the same thing as the as the trade union movement or as other or certain environmentalists or so on. But we have a lot in common with those who use the term just transitions, and I wouldn't quarrel with just using that slogan to identify this aspect, that essentially saying that the working class should not be paying the price for the one-sided and short-sighted economic strategies that have been carried out by the government and the corporations in the past. Nor should the working class have to pay the price for the disruption and change which is going to have to take place in the modern world. Another couple of points simply to, in the category of increasing jobs, protecting, making jobs more secure is improving the apprenticeship program in Alberta, guaranteeing jobs for all successful apprentices, public and auto insurance, and then public ownership to diversify our economy into green technologies, including alternative renewable energy. Alberta is actually really blessed with the number of different potential resources that we have, not just fossil fuels, but we have wind and we have sun and we have, agricultural resources. It is striking the extent to which the capitalist economy has frittered away or failed to capitalize on the resources that we do have in Alberta. We could have a much stronger, a much more modern economy. This, even without full socialism, even if we had just a transitional stage of a government which was prepared to work in the interests of building the Alberta economy and not relying solely on fossil fuels and not conceding everything to the maximum profits, short-term profits of that handful of corporations. So I think, our ideas for developing the Alberta economy are good ideas, they're practical ideas, they're workable ideas. But of course, it's a real challenge to gain the political clout to, in fact, be in a position to start to carry out these ideas. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about the strategic situation in Alberta in terms of the relative strength of the different class forces. The first point is that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas in society. This is stated by Marx long ago in a number of different forms in different writings. And it's really, we really see that being played out in Alberta today. That the energy sector has completely captured the political discourse. One thing is they want us to think that there's no alternative, that there simply could not be any viable economic development in Alberta that wasn't just fossil fuel extraction. They don't want us to believe that there's an alternative that could be based on secondary production using fossil fuels as an input, nor do they want us to think that there's any possibility that there could be economic development in other sectors entirely. The NDP, really, as well as the UCP, has been captured by this point of view. It's my view that one of the reasons for the incredibly backward, reactionary leadership that the Tories have been electing for themselves, every successive leader is worse than the one before, is that the corporations are not particularly afraid of an NDP government. The energy sector is quite confident that an NDP government will really not challenge their basic power, their basic control over the Alberta economy, and will not challenge a tax and royalty regime, which enables them to make maximum profits in minimum time. So they don't particularly, the corporations don't wish to exert much discipline over the Conservative Party. They don't need to force them to be socially responsible. They don't need to prevent them from alienating anybody who's not really medieval minded in terms of social issues and social, their attitudes about education and health and social services and so on. Because the NDP, although obviously it would be an improvement in terms of the implementation of social services and education and healthcare and so on, the NDP would not, in fact, challenge the basic power of the energy sector corporations. So that, those corporations are not particularly perturbed at the idea that the NDP might replace the Conservatives as the provincial government in Alberta. Now, unfortunately, the real obstacle that we face in our political work, in our propaganda, in propagating our point of view, in propagating our program and platform, and building alliances, is that the working class in the energy sector has mostly bought into this outlook that's propagated by the corporations. Taking pride in their work, considering that it's the only possible basis for the Alberta economy, and being very frightened of change. I mean, it is not unreasonable or unrealistic of workers in the fossil fuel sector to be alarmed, because the change is coming. If we don't change, if the world economy doesn't change to a more green economy, less bound to fossil fuels, the ultimate outlook is actually environmental and economic collapse. In which case, whether or not there's jobs in the Alberta tar sands would be the least of our worries. But it's not unreasonable that the working class can see that things are not going on the way they used to, and that this is a scary prospect, especially with a government whose policies are all directed towards shoring up the profits of the corporations, and none of whose policies are directed towards protecting the working class from the effects of this change. So this is a hard nut for us to crack. It's very hard to get our point of view across amongst energy sector workers. But nonetheless, given the way the economy is right now, these are in fact like some of the most strategically most important workers within our province. If they're not won over to socialism isn't going to happen here. So despite the difficulties, it's a challenge that we will have to face in the long run. But it's also my view that we need to emphasize the full employment and the income protection aspects of our strategy, the just transitions aspect. In order to address that legitimate insecurity and fear of workers within the energy sector about an unknown, a change, an unknown future. So it's very important for us to bring forward and emphasize that aspect of our policies and that aspect of our strategy, that we do think that it's the role of government to shield the working class from the hardships and difficulties that would otherwise fall on them with the change, a very significant and relatively sudden change in the whole structure of the economy. So it's very important for us to emphasize the guarantee of employment and the guarantee of income protection during the transition, during periods when workers may need to retrain for new jobs and so on. So I'd like to leave it at that. That's basically the outline of how our party approaches the questions of the energy sector. So I'd like to just at this point throw it open to general discussion. So thank you for your attention. Oh, I see several more people have joined us at the Ukrainian Center, so it's nice to see you. So anybody who wants to say anything, uh, please feel free to just either raise your hand or just start talking here. Okay. Okay, yeah, I see Ian's hand up. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to comment on something you said at the end. A lot of the oil and gas workers are not, they don't have that much actual stake in the success of oil and gas, because a lot of them are basically just contract workers anyways, that either have a temporary construction job or are working at like 3 levels deep of subcontracted from the company that actually owns the, the resource or the infrastructure. So I think people's allegiance to the oil and gas sector is actually like quite temporary. And if they are provided with jobs in other sectors, they will shift their allegiance naturally away from that, just from actually being provided by some other industry or means of life than working for these companies. So like I think it's like important to appeal to them, but also realize that it's not it's not worth necessarily like giving up any sort of battle or strategy as a concession to the oil industry, because I think those will go away on their own as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is really a case of false consciousness, or lack of class consciousness of any workers who feel any loyalty to the industry that employs them. But I mean, as you say, particularly in this case. But we know that there is in fact a lot of propaganda that in the capitalist society in general to obscure that, to try to make people believe that their interests as an employee are the same as the interests of the corporation. You see those bumper stickers that say "I love Alberta oil," and it's not, this point of view doesn't just arrive spontaneously. I think there really is a propaganda machine that actively works to maintain this mistaken point of view in workers, that the bosses' interests are their interests, that they have to be loyal to their bosses in order to keep their job. So you're right, though. As soon as they get a job at another sector, that loyalty will be strongly shaken. Unfortunately, it's a kind of it's a vicious circle. Like with a government which is doing essentially nothing in order to create the new jobs and in order to diversify the economy, and doing nothing in order to create employment or protect people's jobs or livelihood, it's going to be hard for them to get those jobs that would enable them to weaken their loyalty to the fossil fuel sector. So see Hassan has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I as well want to ask you as well, there is conspiracy with the federal government as well. I mean, the fact that Montreal and Quebec is importing refined fuel from Saudi Arabia, and we cannot sell them like oil, and we cannot refine the oil, and even the pipeline to BC to be able to export to China, although it's might affect the environment, but we are not a friendly environment country anyway. Like we are spoiling. We are like we are the second polluting country in the world per capita. So we provide lip service for environment in Canada, and at the same time we didn't build the pipeline that could give relief for Alberta to sell oil outside of US market because US are abusing this relationship. They are buying our crude oil in less than the global market. And it's which is like, I mean, definitely Alberta government is in the pocket of oil company, but at the same time, federal government as well. It's bigger. Like we don't see like even like energy plan for Canada, whole Canada, they don't provide. And we are coming to, as you said, like how we will use uh, the future. We might see the change in the world that consuming oil, and still in Canada, 25% of our sorry, this is my daughter. 25% of our export is crude oil in whole Canada. And we don't see any emergency from the federal government or provincial government to create a alternative for the future even. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Well, yeah, you're quite right. I mean, I think they try to. The fact is that the pipelines, the infrastructure in general, like transportation corridors, the thing, they run north-south, right? Like the whole Canadian economy, all various different regions of Canada are more easily integrated into the corresponding regions of the US than east and west across our country. And they try to, this is presented as if it were a fact of nature, but it's not. These are the results of, more than 100 years of government policy, which has neglected east-west infrastructure, east-west transportation links, and which has simply gone along, created a policy of relying on exporting to the US market rather than diversifying our markets or developing our own domestic market, or making us independent of that one overwhelmingly large customer. So I mean, this has been a deliberate policy. It's not a foregone conclusion that it must be like that. It is not just an act. It is not just, that geography is fate in that sense. So, of course, it's now further complicated by the fact that by the time, pipelines are many multi-year projects, major construction projects. Some, if we immediately set to work creating a whole bunch of pipelines, there's no guarantee that by the time they were actually built and capable of functioning, that there would actually be a market at the other end. In fact, it's my hope that a certain number of countries in the world are going to be making quick enough changes, in response to the threat of global warming, that that there will come a tipping point in the world where the whole world market structure could shift, and there's just where you won't be able to sell oil and gas, and certainly not coal. And so it's a chancy business now to start developing a long-term economic policy based on the export of fossil fuels. And building pipelines is much more long-term sort of strategy than, say, building solar panels. Right? I mean, if you put in a solar panel installation, the very first solar panel, once you hook it up to the grid, can already be generating power. You can't send a single drop of oil through a pipeline until you have the entire pipeline built. So even just from the point of view of the amount of time it takes and our expectations about the uncertainty of long-term markets, pipelines now, it's kind of too late for pipelines. It's it's a bad deal. Karine?
Yeah, I was wondering, there's a lot of talk about Dutch disease, where the economies get so dependent on oil and gas that they actually throw away any economies any businesses that were doing not too badly before. They tend to take a nosedive. and just get fat and lazy off oil export. Do we have any examples of countries that have avoided that? Actually have, Norway might be one, but I mean examples of countries that have somehow managed to get around this Dutch disease of being lazy about their economies because they have all this wealth coming in. I don't know. Do you know of any examples we could use? Because
Okay, well, it's not my area of expertise. I'm hoping that that's something that some of our own members and friends will be able to contribute to the, the ongoing discussion. Like even in the case of Norway, that we, frequently point to as it's a much better capitalist way of managing fossil fuels. They haven't been immune to that problem as well, although they were conscious of it and deliberately attempted to avoid becoming overly reliant on fossil fuels. It's still the case that the lopsided development to a certain extent has taken place, and there is more reliance on the wealth from fossil fuels than would be 100% reliable. So okay, so Ian had his hand up, and then somebody over at the Ukrainian Center. So Ian.
Yeah, I just kind of just two examples that I guess for what Karine was talking about, very different approaches here. But so Saudi Arabia is one of the most oil dependent countries that has built this enormous store of wealth. But they're another one that has actually pushed very hard to move out of that. So their sovereign wealth fund that they have, that's largely from oil and gas revenue, they've been using it to buy tech companies and things like entertainment franchises and sports teams. So obviously that's a lot of capital that they built up through fossil fuels, but they have been diversifying. They've also been particularly buying things in other countries. So there's a lot of Silicon Valley companies, Premier League teams, things like that they're purchasing with their money as a diversification. And the other thing they did was they made the like Aramco, which is their national oil company, they actually made it public. But there was a lot of effort put into basically sell, like I think it was like almost $1 or $2 trillion or some enormous amount of money, selling that to global investors. But a large part of that is for them to make a lot of money selling their oil assets to then diversify their economy. And then the other example I wanted to give was China, because they've used a lot of their, I guess, consumption of oil. Like they're very dependent on oil too, but they've used that to then shift their economy up the supply chain into higher level stuff like high tech semiconductor manufacturing, that sort of stuff, instead of just base raw material processing type stuff. So I don't know if there's countries that have managed to skip that whole process or not, but those are ones that are maybe two different approaches to transitioning out of fossil fuel dependence or production.
Right. Yeah. Well, the thing about Saudi Arabia, of course, it's an unusual case in that, like as you say, they've taken that money and invested it elsewhere, but they haven't invested it in creating jobs in Saudi Arabia, because in fact they never did. Like in some ways they went transitioned straight from a feudal system into a capitalist system, so that the Saudi citizenship is actually quite limited. Like the working class in Saudi Arabia, by and large, are not citizens. Like they import their workers. Like, so the whole idea that capital should be used to diversify their economy in order to provide employment within their country is not part of the picture, right? And that's why so much of that investment has been going into investing in foreign companies, right? Well, it's a smart move on their part, but it's not one. That's not a pattern that we can follow, right? Because we do have a working class who are Canadian citizens, and of course, part of our party's program is to increase citizenship for Canadian workers, like to increase the benefits and the rights to foreign workers who come to this country, to ensure that they have a path to citizenship. So, and of course, the case of China is different because there are socialist aspects to their economy and a communist government. So, they're able to actually implement really large-scale strategic moves I mean, for example, they're working to become like world leaders in, you know, exporting electric buses. Sorry, I have to. Sorry, we're in the middle of a meeting. Can't talk now. So, I mean, it does show, though. I mean, you know, the difference between Saudi Arabia and China shows like something of the difference between what a capitalist economy will do and what a socialist economy will do, faced with that same challenge about, you know, how to make use of that enormous wealth that comes from the fossil fuels, but not remain overly reliant on them. So, okay, somebody at the Ukrainian Center has their hand up. I don't know who it is who wants to talk there.
Yes, it's me. Hi, Naomi. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I just have a question about your point about the green economy and transitioning into green renewable technologies. I'm interested to know how that would deter exploitation. Specifically, I'm thinking of the Site C Dam and the infringement of Treaty 8 territory and the failed court case from multiple First Nations, despite being touted as renewable energy and beneficial for the province. So I'm interested to see how that transition would still exploit people or not. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh, very good question, right? I mean, we have to recognize that renewable energy is not automatically non-exploitative. I mean, if it's a private corporation, you know, doing the work for profit, they're going to be exploiting their workers. And to the extent that it's being done by private corporations, they're going to be lobbying the government for a regime that's going to minimize their expenses and maximize their profits, even at the expense of the environment, Indigenous rights, you know, workers' rights, social rights, and so on. So yeah, it's not automatic, right? That that technologies that don't rely on fossil fuels are going to be they're not necessarily going to be intrinsically less exploitative. It depends on which class is in charge. I mean, and essentially that's why we're communists and not just environmentalists, right? Because we know that it's going to take more than just simply changing from fossil fuels to solar panels to eliminate exploitation and you know, to guarantee Indigenous self-government rights and so on. Those are specific demands in and of themselves. You know, those are also struggles that we have to engage in. What we can do, though, is that we can bring forward more of an overall policy, an integrated policy, where we can talk about economic development and environmental protection and social equality and social rights, and, you know, giving due weight to all those aspects, and not allowing the economic factors to override those. So. Okay, there's a side conversation going on here, I think. We don't hear you there.
No, sorry, Jay, you could have kept continuing, but I just wanted to make the point that I think that Monica's point and your point, Naomi, were not exactly the same thing, because I think Monica meant oppression, national oppression, or however you'd like to characterize it, of Indigenous peoples. And then your point correctly, you did address that, but your point correctly is that exploitation happens in every capitalist enterprise. So anytime a worker is employed by a capitalist enterprise, basically that's exploitation. If it produces surplus value, that's exploitation. But Jeremy made the point that how do we transition to supporting the indigenous control of their resources? And then I just wanted to make the point, which I didn't yet, but that even if Indigenous peoples get a maximum amount of autonomy, and if Indigenous enterprises employ Indigenous workers, that still is exploitation too, if it's a capitalist enterprise, right? Or if it's for exporting whatever commodity or producing whichever commodity is being produced. So it's we're talking about all that at once.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, if there were Indigenous self-government right at this moment, right? I think, you know, like in some ways, a lot of people wouldn't like it because, you know, in a capitalist system with capitalism as, you know, the hegemony of the dominance of capitalist ideology, there's a certain number of Indigenous capitalists or a certain number of Indigenous leaders who, you know, of various kinds, who figure that developing their own Indigenous capitalism is the way forward. Right? Now, we'd happen to disagree with them, but we also do acknowledge that the, you know, Indigenous right to self-government exists. If we form a government and we're in a position to start negotiating, you know, a new deal, we're going to have to negotiate with the Indigenous nations. Each of those nations and communities, you know, has a right to have its own ideas about how they're going to develop. It might not be exactly what the Communist Party thinks is you know, the best. It's still our job, though, to put forward policies that are in the interests of the working class as a whole, like of all nations. So that our policies are in the interests of Indigenous working class people as well as in non-Indigenous working class people. And if things are, you know, if things are going to actually improve for the working class as a whole, the people have to unite around their class interests, not along national lines. Okay, turn on your microphone again there. Alex, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I mean, we don't have to have this discussion at length, or we do, but I think Monica and Jeremy both added, like, we need to examine and develop our strategy in supporting Indigenous struggles for self-determination. But I agree, but I also made the point that communists can't just tail these kind of movements for Indigenous liberation or other forms of democratic struggles. Communists have to support those movements as best we can, but we also have to give our own communist points of view in those struggles, I think, and our criticism of their struggles and the wider political economy. But Jeremy wants to make a point now.
Yeah, my question about strategy is broader. I think a point, I think, where I think we can have an analysis only as good as we're invested in the struggle of these transitions. Like for instance, public ownership doesn't happen overnight. Public ownership happens because of struggle. And I think that's maybe something that in Alberta especially we need to be focusing more on, is how do we develop a step-by-step program on how do we engage the workers that are like the contract workers who are, you know, in 4 months, out 4 months. Like how do we engage with these communities affected by like tailings ponds? Like how do we engage with you know, the fact that we we don't see much revenue coming back into Alberta, like from the use of fossil fuels, and in fact the capitalist system survives out of overproduction. So we can produce and produce and produce without seeing any advances or changes to our living conditions or our livelihoods. Yeah, my point is I think we should do a lot more work as a party, especially in Alberta, of how do we strategically engage with the workers that are doing the work in these things, and how do we engage with the communities that are impacted by the pollution and the destruction of the environment from it. I'm including, you know, laborers, like temporary foreign workers who are installing our solar panels on our wind farms. You know, like those are important questions to be thinking about.
So,
Umberto wants to speak now.
No, I am not going to do any speech.
Okay.
There are something important, really important for us. You know, for us as a club, you know, to be communist is not easy. It's really difficult because we are going to be in between conversation. We are going to be in between the argument when the only enemy that we have is in this hand. Okay, that's all. We have to individualize, we have to put that individual is conservative. That's my enemy. We have to talk with the liberals, even though for me, the liberal and the conservative here in this country is the same thing. And then we have the NDP. That is a political party that is just with, you know, with borders. They are going to be doing something if the conservative allow them to do. How they do that is because they have the power of the money. I am not saying that we have to go and rob the bank or anything like that. I am saying we have to be like that, you know. It's a kind of, we have to be dogs, you know, defending our point of view. And the other thing is contradictions. I can see a lot of contradictions here in whatever is the argument, even in the Naomi speech, there are contradictions, you know, and then we have to look for those contradictions and trying to, if it's one of ours who is doing that, trying to correct that, you know, and then correct that and say, look, for me, this is the problem. You can be contradictory, you know. And the other thing is, we can be helping everybody, but our main point is not only the medics, it's not only the natives in different countries. If we look South America, look at what happened in Peru. You know, that is a good example. The right wingers never, ever, they are defeated. We have to be continued fighting them, arguing with them, and well, with our friend, we have to convince them that we are, so we, the communists, are who have the right to say this, to say that. It doesn't mean that we are going to impose that, because according to the history, there are no communist government, none in the world during the history. That's it.
Yeah.
okay, Corinne.
Yeah, something I don't know if I've seen directly said is what our opinion is on international trade in general. Because with the way things have gone, we have a tremendous amount of global trade. You know, how a garment is made in several different countries, for example, shipped here and shipped there. And this international trade seems to be, my perspective, driven by an effort to drive down wages, because that's what we say is the bargaining, or the one thing that keeps the profit up is driving down wages. And it seems to me that by having more local production, we would be saving a lot of gas around the world by, you know, in terms of the shipping of stuff. We're shipping an awful lot of stuff from all different parts of the world that we may be able to produce locally, but we don't, because the price of labor is not as cheap as we can maybe get it elsewhere. So for the point, I mean, this is not really a provincial perspective so much, although it does affect us. But we don't have too much of a statement on the international trade trade and how that affects oil and gas consumption. The flying of produce from here and there and stuff. I don't know, that's just a commentary. That we should maybe be producing more local economies all over the world that can satisfy their local needs more. And trying to keep wages in a range where we can actually consume what we produce.
Alexander, yeah. Go ahead.
I was wondering if anyone has been following the electoral success of the Communist Party in the Austrian city of Graz, which formed government. I ask because I'm wondering what lessons can be learned already, since electoral success has been lacking historically for communists for obvious reasons anywhere, really. I bring this up since we're discussing our electoral platform.
Which place was that?
I haven't made a particular study of it, right? But it's actually the case, though, that there have been, there are places where there have been, communist governments, particularly at municipal levels. Like it's happened in Italy over a long period of time. There are communist city governments in Italy. But one of the lessons we can draw from that is that apparently, like, the city level is not the critically important level for the levers of power, because it hasn't resulted in a communist government at higher levels, and it has not particularly resulted in any move towards socialism, building socialism in Italy. It's still entirely capitalist country, right? So, each new case is a new case, and we can look at it and see what lessons we might learn from it. But I do think that, strategically, the provincial level is more significant, and the federal level in Canada. In fact, Canada is one of those countries, a kind of anomaly, where provinces are artificially important, like the distribution of powers between the provinces and the federal government has given an artificial importance to provincial governments, despite the fact that no one province really has the resources and the population, so on, to go it alone. But particularly in Canada, of course, like, the municipal governments don't have any real constitutional existence, right? Like, they only exist at the pleasure of the provincial governments. I don't know if you sort of followed the uproar about the previous Ontario government, in a very high-handed way, just kind of amalgamating and different municipalities in the Toronto area and reducing the number of members on the city council and so on. They could just do that by fiat, right? They didn't have to hold a referendum or anything. So I think we can. One of the things we learned from municipal governments, communists elected in municipal governments, is that it can be a way to gain goodwill and appreciation, because communist governments would provide a better level of services, a less corrupt form of government, and so on. But it does point to how limited those things are, like, compared to the actual seizure of power at the level of a whole country. So the question of state power rather than municipal power can't be avoided. But certainly a lot of experience can be gained. A lot of alliances can be built, and members can be attracted, and allies can be found, working at the municipal level. So, Edward?
Yeah, I think the experience in Graz, as far as I know of it, is that the party tailored its rhetoric right directly to workers. And I think, that's how we gain inroads, and that's how any communist party comes to power, is by mainly making a connection to workers and appealing to workers. And when it comes to transitioning and wielding like power on a provincial level, I find using the example of Norway is useful when talking to people about how the state can have a role in transitioning economies and wielding ownership power of your resources. And that I know Norway is a capitalist country, and so you only use this rhetoric as kind of like a way to show that like there are alternatives to using our natural resources. And I just pulled up here, I see that 76% of Norway's non-home wealth is actually owned by the state. They use their resources to become more or less a Trojan horse of using state wealth and to purchase more ownership into the state, and therefore wielding that power to ensure that unions have to be utilized by these companies, and that these companies have to follow the strict regulations on labor that the Norwegian government has put in. And then, that manifests as a lot of, it manifests better for workers themselves, that they gain more autonomy and more power in their union power. Also with that, their transition away from fossil fuel power as just in the use of just taxation. I think 80% of the cars that were sold were electric cars. And so they're able to utilize state power as well to show how a state can transition away from fossil fuels as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I think, one of the sort of lessons is like, that we learn from this is not to worship market forces. Right? Like capitalist propaganda always tries to portray, sort of economic developments as if these were impersonal forces that could not, it just simply couldn't be any other way. Right? Supply and demand, and this is why workers' wages are going down and wealth is accumulated. But in fact, pretty much every economic development relies on government and state support. And what strategy a state uses, what kind of development it supports, is really significant. Whether it's a small country or a large one, whether it's a weak economy or a strong one. Right? There's the idea of the independent risk-taking capitalist, who ventures all and takes the risk and therefore deserves the reward. It's completely a unicorn. There is no such a beast. Right? Capitalism from its very inception has relied on monopolies bestowed by the state or maintained by the state, or tax regimes to protect them, or state investment in infrastructure to promote them. And so it's I think you're right. Like Norway is sort of like the best case scenario for capitalism, the strongest case that could be made for capitalism. But it's also an object lesson in just how dismally our own capitalist state has failed the working people, and how much we are essentially under the sway of imperialism. In our particular case, even though Canada is itself an imperialist country, how much we are in fact beholden to and subservient to American imperialism in terms of all the economic strategies that our state, both the federal government and the provincial governments, what their strategies are. So, Ian?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to expand a bit more on the kind of the role of the state in planning in the transition, because some of the really big shortfalls of market forces are things like expecting everyone to transition to electric cars as the prices of gas go up. But like one of the big immediate problems we face with that is that there's a massive shortage of electric cars. People can't purchase one even if they want them, and the price of gas has gone up anyways. So instead you have people just having to foot the bill of gasoline, or being without a car, and then their job and and livelihood is affected. And so that goes into like it requires the government to actually plan on multiple levels to transition away from making people so dependent on something like that. It actually enables a transition if people have, public transit, or the actual, structure of their city or country is different, so that they can exist without just wastefully using fossil fuels. And then also when it comes to energy generation, there's lots of really bad effects too, because things like nuclear power might not be competitive in the power market, so it never gets built. But maybe if people had been building that 20 years ago, maybe that would be, a better, position we'd be in to actually continue using that. But now it would be, if we wanted to build it, we have to do all this catch up, and the companies that we would want to build those won't make any money, so they won't build them. So it's just, at some point, the government has to be a part of the transition. It requires planning.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Michael?
Yeah, the other point that's kind of interesting to me is often the computer technology industry is touted as sort of the greatest success of capitalism, as a look at sort of how great the things we can build are with the profit motive. But what I find interesting is, if you actually look at the history, computers arrived roughly 100 to 200 years late, because Charles Babbage couldn't actually get funding for the original computer he designed.
Right.
So anyway, if there's any point to that, the point is that I think a big opportunity is creating more opportunities, whereas under the current system, opportunities are essentially limited to those with capital.
Yeah, good point. Right. So, okay. I think, yeah, there's these persistent sort of urban myths, about the suppressed patents. Like, somebody came up with a spectacular invention, like the invention of the electric car, that was, and the car companies bought it up and suppressed it. Or somebody's got a cure for cancer, and the pharmaceutical companies bought the patent and suppressed it because it's more profitable for them to keep people buying expensive drugs for long-term treatment of cancer, instead of this miracle cure, which would get rid of their cancer right away, and so on. I mean, these are mostly urban myths, but it is also true, right? Like that modern capitalism distorts the whole process of research and development. Like, doing good science is really hard, right? Under the best of circumstances. It's really hard for somebody who's worked really hard on a scientific experiment to retain their objectivity and really seriously judge the quality of their own work, and not just try to find ways to justify their own pet theory and make it seem more important or more significant than it is. It's hard, it's hard for people to maintain that level of discipline doing real science and real research. So much, and it's so much harder when you then mix the profit motive into it, where the kind of research which is going to be done is directed not to, what is it most important to us to find out, or in terms of practical research and development, what would be the greatest benefit to society as a whole, say nothing of the working class, but just what can we sell? What can we make the most profit on in the short term? And so I think we probably don't even know all the different kinds of technological development that have been stunted, that could possibly have happened faster or sooner or better. We won't really know until after the fact. I think one of the things that socialism will do is liberate the engineers. Right? is that eventually the engineers would be able to give their real opinion about the, what will work and what won't work, and what it will cost or not cost, not have to tailor their remarks to just the profit motive of the company that employs them. So, anyway, yeah, Luis.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that when you were talking about the like applied research and like liberating the engineers, we're actually seeing like universities are pretty useless to do any change in this or provide any voice, because they're tied to just publications, which is just perpetuation of status of deans and the faculty, rather than applied and active research. And for example, for the green economy, we're mostly seeing that like our engineers take the engineers are the one taking the money, but all the labor, all the hard work, all the dangerous work that is replacing a lot of the stuff is left off to immigrants, which have to pay to get internships. That's insane. So that's my take on that one. Because yeah, like invest more in science, but like invest more in science is going into faculties rather than the actual students, right? Like because they're paying tuition to get trained, and paying, yeah, not even paid to actually do applied research.
Yeah, well, obviously, like, we need both. I mean, we need science, we need research, we need to fund academic institutions so that they'll be independent of corporate control and corporate influence. But also, people who are not researchers, who are not academics, have human rights and are entitled to a decent livelihood and decent working conditions and so on. So we have to be careful not to be seen to be trading off one against the other. I mean, both of those things are important. Because I do think, I mean, the realities of the global economy, right, is that climate change is real, global warming is real. We got to stop burning stuff, right? Like the effects are already becoming more and more dangerous, in fact, catastrophic every year. Floods and storms and increased hurricane seasons and droughts and ocean acidification and so on. Like these factors are, there's an ongoing environmental crisis that we simply must address. But it's also the case that even the capitalist economies need growth and development. They need the development of new technologies. Like the overall history of capitalism in the world so far has been a sequence of major technological advances that were promoted, funded, and subsidized by states, various imperialist states. Like whether the initial era of imperial conquest is followed by periods of neocolonialism. So the export of commodities was replaced by the export of capital, and capital was used to create infrastructure. Like, so there's the era of automobilization, essentially, using state funding to build roads so that people would buy cars. And then now we have the era of computerization and automation, also, very much funded by, promoted by government policies, government subsidies. In effect, the effective economies, the strong economies, are the modern economies, are the ones that are going to embrace technological change, because that's where the possibility of new industries, new employment, new development will take place. So even if there were no such thing as global warming, even if there were no environmental demands. The strong economies would be the ones that would embrace new technologies, because that's what gives economic opportunity. So even without any environmental issues, developing electric cars, solar panels, new higher levels of automation, artificial intelligence, so on. The new technologies are the way forward for economies as a general rule. So it throws into even more relief just how backward, how provincial our provincial government is in its renewed loyalty to a fossil fuel economy, when that's not the way forward, even for economy which currently does rely on fossil fuels. Like what Corinne talked about, the Dutch disease, this is, it's now becoming recognized throughout the world that this relying on that resource that you already have, no matter how much wealth it's generating right now, it has its own dangers and its own difficulties. And so it's important for a strong economy that we do have research and development and new technologies. And so it's in the interest of the working class as well, right? Like even with a socialist government also would embrace research and development and new technologies. It's one of the ways in which we can strategically move forward to develop the economy, to provide full employment, to provide a better life for working people when they actually can benefit from the fruits of their own labor. So it's really not an either or. Either we put the money into the universities, or we put the money into the, we raise the standards for immigrant workers or apprentices or so on. It's a both and situation. So, Adrian, go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
I just have a few points that I would like to mention, and I might have more later on. So I don't know if people are aware of this, but a few years ago, there was, I guess you call it a market analysis that predicted that the global oil demand will peak in the 2040s. Now, this might happen sooner than it was originally predicted, meaning that the amount of money that we can get from oil is only going to go down from there because the demand will slowly decline, which means that we need to leverage the revenue that we can get from it now in order to protect ourselves from that inevitability economically. So that I think that needs to be, that's only maybe 20 years or less from now, and that needs to be a point that I think the party could really push on. And one thing that I'm reading the program for the provincial election in 2019 is where it gets from. It calls it, this is kind of a silly point, but it calls it the tar sands. And I know that Albertans hate the term tar sands. It's just a really kind of like a PR point. We should really call it the oil sands. We don't want to alienate the actual working class people by antagonizing them in these kind of really little things. So I really recommend changing that from a PR standpoint. And there's a lot of talk about like, what do we do first? And there's the indigenous land issue, and there's a socialization issue and the nationalization issue. Ultimately, none of it matters unless the party is actually in a position of political power. And so we have to get there first. And then once we get there, we can take care of those more specific things. Not that we can't talk about and plan for it, but considering the election is drawing near, I think that our discussions should be more based on getting to that position of political power. One thing that is in here is the royalties to change it to a fixed rate. I don't know why nationalizing isn't in here. But if it was, then the royalty system would be irrelevant because you have direct ownership and the revenue from exploitation of the resources goes directly to the public anyways. Another one is, it's sort of been mentioned in the chat. I don't see, maybe I just haven't found it yet. There's no mention of nuclear power, which is really important. As energy demands increase, nuclear power will likely be the only thing that can maintain a stable grid across developed countries. And one thing is, here in Alberta, we have the ability to leverage hydrogen as an alternative fuel source. Hydrogen can be burned in people's homes to produce heat as a replacement for natural gas. You can have hydrogen-powered vehicles instead of gasoline-powered vehicles. And hydrogen can be made from water, of course, and we can use the fuel resources we have to kind of transition towards hydrogen, because we can't get rid of oil entirely. Oil is used for so many more things than just fuel. You know, like you said before, there's plastics, there's petrochemicals and lubricants and all kinds of other commodities that oil is a major component of. So transitioning away from burning fossil fuels for power and heat is really important. We can't get rid of it entirely. And the added bonus of making those things is that you have the value addition through tier 2, tier 3, and so on components and products. And that's like that.
Yeah. Yeah, all those are all, yeah, you know, important issues that will have to be worked out, like in an actual practical program of economic development and, you know, greening of the economy going forward. I don't know. I'm going to say, you know, I'm not an engineer, and I don't know about where we should stand on nuclear power. I mean, the party has just actually decided at its last convention to look into this question more, like revisit the question of the pros and cons of nuclear power. But again, this, you know, there's also sort of problem with hydrogen. I mean, depending on what you get hydrogen by splitting water, essentially. What's the energy source for splitting the water? It could be green or not. Like if you're burning fossil fuels in order to create the process of dividing the oxygen and the hydrogen in the water, or breaking down other chemicals to get the hydrogen. If you're using fossil fuels to do that, then hydrogen is not really a fuel source as much as a fuel transmission device, right? So, you know, you still have to come back to having other sources. So I don't know about all the technical details about that. But again, this is a situation where we're in a position of power. We can actually ask the real engineers what they really think. We don't have to have every technical question solved right now. What we do need to do is like clarity about what are the political stages to get there, not necessarily the technical stages of building that infrastructure. And you know, what you pointed out as well, right? Like we have things in our program there. I think what you've said is, you know, the point is well taken, is that we need to be a bit clearer about the transitional steps and what order they come in. It's not just a heap of different suggestions like raise royalties, a single market, a single seller in the market, nationalizing the resources. Of course, they don't all happen together, right? Like those are actually steps along the way. Like we could raise the royalties, you know, like that could be bill number 1. That could happen in the first week of working class power. Creating the individual marketing agency, well, that would take a couple of months to set up. The moving to the point of actually nationalizing the resources as a whole, moving to actual socialism, that would be a much longer process. So I think your point is well taken. We need to be clear about which of these points are stepping stones along the way, and if they actually would have to happen in a certain order, let's say so. But part of the reason I think this discussion we're having tonight is valuable is that it's not just a question of saying this during an election campaign. We have to make the case for these ideas every day, like day in and day out. We have to try to win the working class over to our point of view. And the elections are only one part of the period of time in which we have to do that work. So it's really important for us all to have a grasp of these ideas, to be able to put them forward, to be able to argue for them and win people over to this point of view. And we don't wait for an election campaign to do that. Neither do we stop doing it once an election is over. So, okay, so I see Corinne next.
Yes, the thing there seems to be a difficulty getting people to accept nationalization, or somehow that seems to stump them. You throw it out there, like I did. I threw out the question at a webinar on the tailings ponds, about the amount of crime that had been done. Don't you think it should be nationalized? They have enough crime that they don't deserve to own anything anymore. Yet I didn't get any response from any speaker. It's like it's just they can't somehow accept that, and they haven't been taught to accept it. But the idea of a marketing board, I think, is a way to prepare them as to how it could be done. It'd be a first step to getting acceptance. Mm-hmm. And to actually getting some control over this industry. That's one way of looking at it. Because I was sort of surprised because these were sort of left-leaning people and I just got nowhere.
Well, I think it is, it's a reflection of the reality of how much the corporate sector really has encircled and captured the whole political discourse, not just in Alberta, but pretty much in Canada as a whole. Right? Like, it could be that they didn't respond because they just didn't know what to say. That it's just not an idea that they have thought about or know about. So you were right. It's a big job we have to try to promote these ideas, and to find the best language for it, right? Like, for example, the suggestion about the use of the phrase tar sands as opposed to oil sands. In some ways, we didn't just carelessly say tar sands. We decided to say tar sands because we didn't want to participate in that sort of whitewashing of trying to rename them as oil sands. But perhaps that was a mistaken sort of line of thought. Maybe we really should go with the phrase oil sands, because if using the phrase oil sands rather than tar sands is the only thing that stood in the way of the working class of Alberta as a whole embracing socialism and embracing Marxist ideas, we'd be awful fools to insist on the phrase oil sands. I know it's a little bit more complex than that. So I think it's a discussion that we actually should address and deal with going forward. So, Ian?
Yeah, I think with the how to get people to believe in nationalization, I think a lot of Albertans kind of already naturally believe it. They just have it in a really bizarre way where whenever someone says something like, "Oh, people in Quebec should pay for the oil that is ours in Alberta," or make any sort of statement like that about ownership of the resources here, they are making an argument for nationalization without realizing it, because most of that oil is owned by foreign companies, whoever the shareholders of the oil company are. So if they think it's their oil and they deserve the revenue and profits for it, which they think people should pay, then they're basically they already believe it. They just need to get that untangled in their head about how that would actually happen.
Good point. Yeah. Okay. Alexander?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly mention, I heard something from a nurse when I was at the hospital, and she had a useful term I found called battered voter syndrome or something. Anyways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I've said before that that in many ways that life under capitalism is a kind of it's the chronic as opposed to acute form of the Stockholm syndrome. The fact that workers embrace capitalism, that workers that people swallow this line of talk about how capitalism is the only possible system, and believe a fairy tale that their interests are somehow the same as the interests of their employers. But like Stockholm syndrome, right? Like really, it's a restatement of what Marx said, 150 or so years ago, like that the prevailing ideas in any society, in any epoch of history, are the ideas of the ruling class. Right? But it's not fixed for all times. It's our job is to, really fight for that exceptional moment when people see through all those lies and repudiate those capitalist ideas, and start to think independently about their own class interests. So this fundamentally is why we need a communist party and not just a left wing of the NDP, is that we really do have to fight for those ideas that will promote class consciousness, so that there comes a moment when the working class are not the just battered voters. They're not just the victims of the system. They become real actors on the stage of history. So, Michael.
I'm not sure it's quite as clear cut as people just don't support nationalization. It's possible that it's just the internet echo chambers that I inhabit, but it seems like there's increasingly widespread support for nationalization. Certainly you don't see it as much in the oil industry, but I've seen increasing support for example, nationalization of telecommunications industries.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yes, I think people can understand when you make the case for any specific case, right? Somehow or another, it seems to be harder to make the general case. Right? I mean, people can see abuses in the, particularly awful abuses in the capitalist system, and see that there's a remedy. There needs to be a remedy for that. What's harder to see is that the system itself is abusive. Like there's a use of the word exploitation, for example, where people talk about it as if they mean only just the worst cases of the abuse and mistreatment of workers. With the worst working conditions. It's a lot harder to make the case. People are more resistant to the idea that the system as a whole is an exploitative system, that every workplace is a situation of exploitation. I mean, that's what capitalism is. That exploitation is the extraction of surplus value from the labor of others. It's there in every workplace, no matter how nice your boss is, no matter how good your working conditions are, no matter how much an employer actually abides by all the rules and regulations and standards. So I think just generally speaking, it's harder to make the case for a broader, more abstract understanding of a concept than each individual concrete case. Yeah, Michael.
It seems to me like maybe part of what we're trying to overcome, and this might be less applicable to the younger generations, but speaking for myself as a millennial, it seems to me like there's a lot of sort of bias against communism in the older generations, potentially as a legacy of McCarthyism in the Cold War. As a member of the younger generation and as a member of the particular subset of demographic that's sympathetic towards communism, my big issue, and I guess this has sort of been the perpetual issue of communism, is lacking market forces. What replaces that? And I guess the worry is that what replaces that is authoritarianism. And I think that we're at kind of a unique point in history where we can give a different answer to that question. We can say, instead of authoritarianism, we've invented this crazy, wonderful thing called the internet and networks and communications technologies that allow many people to talk to many people, and that do allow for organization without centralized top-down authority. And I don't know, maybe there's an opportunity to incorporate that into messaging that might be a little bit more palatable to some people. That was my only thought.
Well, I'm going to say that that's a whole other, a couple of hours of introduction and many, many hours of discussion. Corinne? Yeah, Corinne, you've got your hand up. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I was just responding to that. You are probably right. It does take a lot of talk about that, but we are going to have reaction, and we have to respond to reaction. That's the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's going to be, they're going to fight back because they're losing their wealth and their control, and they will fight back. Anyway, so to think otherwise, it's just they will, and they have. Anyway, that's all.
Okay. We're coming up on 2 hours now. It's been about 1 hour and 3/4. Is there anybody else? Is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet who would like to say something? Just giving.
I think.
Yes, Veronica.
Just branching off of Michael's point, something that I've noticed amongst my peers in the younger generation as well is that, yeah, there seems to be a hesitancy to accept communism as a real alternative just because of the name. They're totally on board with the actual meat of what we advocate, but they're so scared from this lingering notion that communism is a bad word, that if you say you're a communist, they tend to shy away from that, and they say they would support socialism because that's somehow, I don't know, safer to them, or they veer to anarchism because they think that's safer, whereas communism is allegedly loaded with all this authoritarianism. So I think showing that communism is not inherently authoritarian is something very important as we, champion our platform.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated matter, right? I mean, obviously our enemies, the capitalists themselves are always going to try to portray us in the worst possible light. So from the very beginning, they've tried to give this image of communism as a sort of sinister conspiracy, as opposed to what we actually do, which is that to the best of our ability, day and night, we try to be completely open about what we want to do. We would be really happy to have every word we said put up on billboards, right? We're not a conspiracy. The conspiracy is, the conspiracy of silence, which prevents us from putting forward, there's far from a level playing field in putting forward the ideas of different political parties in a capitalist system. So we're going to be accused of that no matter what happens. So yeah, you're right. We have to confront those accusations. We're going to have to work, figure out how do we put our message forward more effectively so that people really will hear it, what we're really saying, not only listen to us through the point of view of the 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 stereotype that they've heard before. But ultimately, I think it really boils down to, it's not just what we say, it's what we do. So, we've only touched on it slightly this evening of talking about how we actually work with allies, how we work in mass movements, so that we don't just put forward our point of view as this is the opinion of the Communist Party, but we actually work in mass movements and on campaigns for various kinds of reforms in social justice and equality movements and so on. How we work with our allies to actually fight for those particular goals, and that we gain, how do we gain a level of respect that we earn through the practical work we do with our allies. So as I say, we haven't really talked about that much this evening, but that's another important aspect of how do we get our point across. So it's not just by saying what we think, but by showing through our actions that we can be trusted, we can be relied on. So Alexander?
Yes, I just wanted to speak on the issue of capitalist technology innovation and how currently the neoliberal project is already backtracking on educational funding all over the place, since they recognize that quality education, including the actual study of Marxism and such, is one way they can destroy themselves. So it's like really a pharaonic policy. It's like if they can't read, they can't do anything. It's not that bad yet, but
Well, yeah, I think you're really right. Like that capitalism in earlier periods, in a period of expansion of capitalism, promoted public education. They needed a more educated workforce, and so they promoted education. Capitalism in its decline, in its overripe stage, which is really where we are now. This is another symptom of the decline of capitalism. It has nothing more to offer. That it's for capitalism. At the early stages, there was such a thing as progress under capitalism. They were building things that hadn't been built before. But in its final stage now, yeah, education is a menace to the capitalist system, because the dangers of educated workers who have some capacity for analyzing is worse than any difficulties that might arise to them from a shortage of well-trained workers or well-trained engineers or whatever. So the US I think is the poster child for this, for like this hatred of education. And in many ways, I think it goes right back to slavery. It goes back to the racism which has, poisoned US society throughout its whole existence, that they do not support public education. They're very weak in supporting any kind of public benefits, because essentially a public benefit would benefit African Americans, people of color of all different races and ethnicities, as much as it would the white people. So there's racism is an underlying factor in their failure to support public education. But it's actually it's why they are in decline now as a leading imperial power, as a leading capitalist power. They don't have the engineering know-how to be at the forefront. It's actually been a generation or more that they've had to rely on importing engineers, like not importing actual trained professionals, but also importing students to train as engineers. Like the best students have to draw upon the whole global source of supply of the best potential engineers, because they haven't been developing the full potential of their own population. Their educational system is so bad. So even many other capitalist countries are doing a better job because they haven't been held back by the racism that divides their own societies internally. So, this is, I mean, this is yet again, just one other of the argument for why it's really important for us to fight for the unity of the working class, to fight against racism and, against xenophobia, to fight against homophobia or transphobia, to fight for the equality of women, to fight for the rights of indigenous people and so on. We have to fight anything that would tend to divide the working class, because fundamentally it's a campaign to divide and conquer. And it's a united working class is really a prerequisite for working class power. So that's why all these other campaigns are not just side issues. They really do feed into the overall fundamental goal of uniting the working class with a working class ideology and a Marxist perspective. Anybody else wants to say anything? We've actually gone rather far afield from the basic question of the energy sector in Alberta. But I think it's actually been a useful discussion, because partly what we need to discuss is how do we make our case for our own policies and our own platform. So I look forward to seeing you all again, and hopefully more as well. We have already decided that we will have another session, another sort of online session, the date of which is February 19th, which is a Sunday. And so the plan was to try try a Sunday afternoon event and see whether that's feasible for everybody. And that session will focus more attention on health, education, and social services, like the aspect of social needs of the working class and the movements that are fighting to protect those social services and to develop them. So again, starting in the context of the coming provincial election, but not restricting ourselves to that. So once again, I thank you all for attending. I thank everyone who contributed their ideas, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.